But what we saw from the multimeter, the Zoom poll, one of the highest scores was on finance, finance, finance. I would like to start off in this panel discussion with Dr. Olufunso. On Thursday, 29th June, last week, you published an article in the Business Daily Africa. Title is Climate Financing in Africa Adequate and Effective? And you indicated in that article, the continent of Africa needs 3 trillion between 2020 and 2030. So in 7 years from now, we're supposed to be providing about 277 billion, but the continent receives just barely about 30 billion annually, which is just 11% as you articulated in that article. And you concluded the article with very powerful 2 words, scale and speed. From what you've heard, and Richard did indicate that we must be able to channel financing to the communities that are already suffering loss and damage. Can you explain briefly what you meant by scale and speed in this context?
Thank you, Richard. A very good afternoon to everyone. And this has been an interesting conversation. And thank you to organizers for inviting me. I think in the interest of time, we need to understand that we are talking about a continent today that is dealing with the crisis of climate change at an unprecedented level. And let me put that in a context, into a very useful context. I live in Kenya, and I saw that in the Menti, a lot of people are from Kenya. If you notice in the last 10 years, every last drought was the worst drought in the history of droughts. So the one 2 years ago was drought. The one 2 years before then was the worst drought in the history of drought. So what is happening? We're dealing with a frequency of high severity and highly severe crisis. So you're dealing with, the depth of crisis that is overwhelming many countries. And look, Kenya is not a very, very poor country, absolutely not. It's a middle income country, but yet it's still severely impacted by this crisis. And when you compare that to other regions that are much poorer, it's different. So adaptation in that context become a policy priority as well as an operational priority for a lot of the African countries. We've seen this in their NDCs, we've seen this in their NABs, but then there's a huge challenge when it comes to finance because the scale of response that we have to invest in must match the scale of crisis that we're dealing with. And when you look at the finance flows, unfortunately, it's not that. So what I meant in the conclusion of that article was we need to do big things within a short period of time. And I think it's very important. We have the intention of doing big things, but unfortunately, we don't have a long time to do them. We need to do big things within a short period of time. And those big things require that we aggregate new strategic partnership with new financial instruments beyond grants and concessional loans into new instrument innovations and bring that to an investment plan, something that is able to crowd in the required partners, not just public sector, but private sector as well, and as well as local communities. And unfortunately, and I want to close with this, unfortunately, most adaptation projects in Africa are actually experiencing the lowest disbursement rates. So even for the money that we have received, we're complaining that it's not enough because adequacy and effectiveness of climate finance are quite linked together. So even for the money that you have received, we're not doing well to be able to deploy them on the ground and to make sure that they trickle down. And that is the challenge. And I think when we get to loss and damage, we must be able to look back and see what has our experience been in adaptation, in mitigation, and finance, and be able to see how do we do things differently going forward. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Doc, for that. And I like the aspect you mentioned that the scale of response must match the scale of need. And when you look across the continent, as you've rightly painted the picture using Kenya, the continent is an informal continent, meaning that most of the people but 80% are in the informal sector. They do not have bank accounts. They actually survive from hand to mouth, as they say. If the amount of money that is needed, using your word, scale matching the need, rapidness matching need, how will this money reach these communities? What would you say, very briefly?
Thank you. Sometimes our response must not necessarily be putting money into people's account. Mm-hmm. But if we can provide what people spend money on, then we will still be solving the problem. In some local communities in rural part of Africa, families, households are spending up to 40% of household income on water. So if you're able to provide that water, and even if they are just spending 10% of their income instead of 40%, you don't have to put that 30% saving in their account, but you're providing the resources that they would have spent money on. So that's one way of solving the problem. But nevertheless, there is a need and value for us to be very inclusive financially and to be able to create assets. So it is very important to look at that. And that's where the role of communities become very important in this.